The face of the UFC doesn't really exist anymore, and this is intentional. Every major sports league has a star or the face of that league. If you think the NBA, you think LeBron James. If you think MLB, you think Shohei Ohtani. And I know there are multiple leagues within soccer, but if you think about the sport in general, you think Messi or Ronaldo. These stars are not only the best at their sport or at one point the best at their sport, but are also globally marketable and are essentially the ambassadors of their sport. For casual fans or those trying to get into a sport, you would typically watch games, events, or highlights of the biggest star in that sport. And whenever these stars come out to play, the general audience will tune in live, and the hope is for the general audience watching to become casual fans and eventually dedicated fans. Though in the current state of the UFC, which happens to be the biggest representative of the sport of MMA, I feel like the organization doesn't have that star, that guy or girl that can bring in casual fans. And obviously the UFC used to have that star in Conor McGregor. In his prime, Conor almost single-handedly took over the world and brought the UFC and the sport of MMA to another level that allowed casual sports fans to tune in. But fast forward to now, even though the UFC continues to put on great cards and, in my opinion, grow their talent pool to better than ever, I think the UFC doesn't have that one megastar that draws in crowds like Conor McGregor. And I also think this was an intentional move by the UFC. So let me explain. So let's first talk about the stars in the UFC right now. I did a poll over the weekend to gauge who you guys thought was the face of the UFC. First, we have probably my vote for the closest thing to the face of the UFC, and its megastar, Israel Adesanya. Izzy just had a huge performance against longtime rival Alex Pereira and is going to fight again against Sean Strickland. And speaking of this fight, a word from today's sponsor, DraftKings. Hey UFC fans, we've got a good one going down in Australia this weekend. Adesanya will be stepping into the octagon to defend his title against Sean Strickland. Does he have what it takes to win it all? Make your picks on the fights this weekend official with my partners at DraftKings Sportsbook. New customers who bet just $5 will get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Get in on the action this weekend by downloading the DraftKings Sportsbook app, and don't forget to use my promo code TJ Loves Fights. That's right, new customers will instantly receive $200 in bonus bets when they bet just $5 on any of this weekend's fights. Stay in on the action and use your $200 in bonus bets on DraftKings same fight parlays for a shot at an even bigger payout. Combine multiple bets together from the same fight, including number of rounds and method of victory. DraftKings is the only place where you can bet same fight parlays. If sports betting is not available in your state, don't worry. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy. DraftKings is offering huge UFC contests this weekend with massive cash prizes up for grabs. Guys, download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers, again, use promo code TJ Loves Fights and just bet $5 on any wager and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code TJ Loves Fights only at DraftKings. I don't think people give Izzy enough credit for how active he has been in his prime, and he also brings in a lot of people to his fights and is a big star in the Oceania region, especially in Australia and New Zealand. But I think a couple things set him back from being a true megastar and face of the UFC. Firstly, he is kind of cringe when he tries to talk shit. I think you either have to be completely a nice, humble, good representation of the sport, or you have to fully commit to shit talk and the villain role, and there's no reward for being in between. I've watched a lot of Izzy YouTube videos, and when he's genuine, he really does seem like a nice and likable guy, but as soon as he gets on the mic, man, he'll drop some clearly rehearsed, that sounded way harder in my head lines, like the classic Frozen like Elsa, and say some lines I can't really even say on here. Additionally, he's had a boring reputation that still kind of lingers. I'm not saying Izzy is boring at all, especially with his rematch against Alex Pereira, but those couple of uneventful fights during Izzy's first push to stardom did no help. When Izzy was first pushed towards being a superstar in 2020 up until 2022, during this time Izzy had a fight with Romero and 3 fights in a row that started the Izzy boring label, starting with Marvin Vettori, then a 3rd fight with Robert Whittaker, and then finally Jared Cannonier. Again, I want to stress that Izzy isn't a boring fighter, but not having a memorable performance during his championship reign besides Paulo Costa really hurt his reputation with casual fans. Next, we have Jon Jones, which based on this poll, you would think there is a consensus face to the UFC because Jon Jones raked in a majority of the votes. However, I don't think many dedicated UFC fans would agree. Jon Jones in his prime was probably the face of the UFC and definitely the most known outside of the sport, but that was almost 10 years ago. Even though Jon Jones is probably the most well-known UFC fighter of all time, besides Conor, and pulled off historic numbers in his return against Cyril Gane, Jon is definitely past his prime and is not as active or in as many media headlines as a true superstar would be. The next guy, Sean O'Malley, feels like an industry plant, to be honest. On paper, Sean checks off every box a star needs. A very unique look that the casual fans will recognize, an exciting fighting style, big performances and big knockouts, and a shit talker on the mic. But to me, his rise seems so forced and almost manufactured. From the feeding of lackluster talent for amazing striking performances, to the jump and very controversial win over a former champ, to the build-up and eventually defeating of Aljamain seemed way too perfect for Dana and the gang. And I know in the beginning of the video, I said the UFC intentionally wants to avoid superstars, but Sean O'Malley seems like a controlled star that grows only within the boundaries of Dana and the UFC. Finally, I think Volk and Charles are in the same boat in that they are both giant stars in their respective countries, but namely heavy favorites of the dedicated and hardcore fan base. Both guys deliver massive performances at the highest level and are nice and generally well liked in the community, but honestly, if you ask somebody outside of the realm of the UFC, Charles Oliveira and Alexander Volkanovski are probably not the first names that come to their mind. So as you can see, these stars have one thing or another that is holding them back from being the true face of the UFC. But why is it like that? Firstly, let's talk about the current model of the UFC. They really have a promote the brand, not the fighter mentality. I've talked about this approach in depth in these videos, but essentially, they put a lot of money back into the brand. The UFC pays its fighters somewhere around 17 to 19% of their total revenue, which is by far the lowest of any major sports organization, with most of these leagues paying their athletes about 50% of their revenue. This low pay of fighters allows the UFC to put that money back into the organization and grow the brand even further. This is shown in how they promote their events, in that they will promote the actual event itself and the depth of the cards, rather than the one main fight like boxing. They do this because they don't want any one star to get too big. The UFC ultimately wants to avoid Francis Ngannou situations in which a star in their prime can use their star power and championship status to leverage either a bigger contract or a better deal somewhere else. So the approach by the UFC is to diversify star power. Again, they don't want to over-rely on one star. Instead, star power is evenly distributed and every weight class kind of has a face now. If someone big in the UFC leaves now, it's not that big of a hit in comparison to having a Conor-like figure leave in his prime. So instead, star power is grown within the confines of the UFC. It's controlled and it's manufactured just like Sean O'Malley, and they want to grow stars to bring something new to the brand, but they don't want them too big to destroy them financially when they leave. But why can the UFC financially get away with this? Normally, building a star is much better because of the star benefits described before. If you have a big enough star or the face of that sport, it helps in getting casuals into that sport and you help build the brand even bigger. But the UFC, in comparison to other sports organizations and leagues, is in a very unique and very interesting position. Shout out this article for bringing up this point, but essentially when the UFC got bought out by ESPN for a record-breaking number, the UFC was also guaranteed a minimum $150 million a year plus an additional amount of money depending on if they hit a certain quota in terms of ticket and pay-per-view buy sales. So because of this consistent, steady flow of money coming in each year, the UFC is no longer incentivized to make superstars anymore to draw in revenue. Before the buyout in 2019 of the UFC by ESPN, the UFC heavily relied on giant stars such as Conor McGregor, Jon Jones, GSP, Anderson Silva to bring in not only brand recognition, but also financial gain. So now that the UFC has a steady flow of money, they really don't have to harbor the risk of creating a mega star because they can create enough stars in the promotion as a whole to continue to bring in those pay-per-view numbers to hit that quota and get money. Really, the only organization hurting here by this move is probably ESPN, as their acquisition, the UFC, isn't really incentivized to grow megastars and bring in more cash flow. But with the UFC's overwhelming dominance in the MMA market and their huge brand already being recognized throughout the globe, I don't think ESPN really cares. So what do you guys think? Is there a face to the UFC? Is there not? Is that intentional? And do you think my theory of why the UFC doesn't really have a face is correct? Again, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next week. Peace.